research has focused precisely on the question of what our human capabilities are, how they evolved, how they function, how we can better understand them, perhaps how we can be better people by understanding them. Dr. Carruthers has a very distinguished career in the philosophy of mind and in cognitive science. He studied at Leeds and earned his doctorate at Oxford, studying with the, if I may say, great Michael Thomas. During these early years, we learned he reportedly was a Wittgensteinian, but we agreed not to hold that against him. His accomplishments include that he founded the Hansen Center for Cognitive Science at the University of Sheffield. He's published many articles, edited many very interesting, influential volumes on innateness and other topics, and published many well-received and influential books. I've long admired his work on consciousness, his work on the question of innateness, and his work on defending the massive modularity thesis, the idea that the human mind is formed with many independent functional, partly independent functional modules. And his work always really demonstrates theorizing based upon rigorous understanding, rigorous scientific results. His most recent book is The Opacity of Mind, which just appeared at Oxford University Press, which is the press which publishes the wisest of philosophers. That's a joke for those of you who know that I published on that press. This is a striking book, I really think, which argues that our conceptual understanding of ourselves is founded on the same capability that underlies our conceptual understanding of others. And if you think about this for a little while, you realize it's quite a radical hypothesis, and it really suggests a very different way of understanding ourselves. So I ask you to please extend a welcome to Dr. Carruthers.
Very much. Very honoured to be here and give this talk. And the talk's going to be pulling out some of the themes from the book, and I ought to show you the cover just so that you can see how pretty it is. It's far too big for you to want to read, but you might at least buy it and put it on your coffee table and have people admire it. So what I'm trying to do in the talk is, first of all, sketch the traditional view of self-knowledge, especially self-knowledge of one's own current thoughts, one's own current attitudes, and sketch some of the problems with them, or at least with, I'll pick out one version, in a sense, views, and say some of the problems with that. I'll then present some instances of data that cause problems for all traditional views of self-knowledge. So these are experiments that show how easily we confabulate about our own even current or very recently past thoughts. So we unknowingly tell falsehoods about what we think we're thinking or have just thought. Okay. And that's a problem for all of the traditional views. I'll then sketch what I think is the true theory of self-knowledge, which I call the interpretative sensory access theory. I'll explain that when we come to it. And I'll illustrate briefly how that coheres really rather nicely with a range of different theories in cognitive science. And then I'll take on the competing intuition and ask how we should explain it, because we all have this intuition that we just know our own thoughts immediately and directly and transparently. So where is that intuition coming from if it's radically false? If I'm right, it is. And then I'll just conclude. Okay, so traditional views, well, you know a little bit of philosophy, you know about Descartes, but his views were by no means unique. Actually, very similar things have been believed by many philosophers in the Western tradition, and as I'll mention later, also Eastern tradition. So Descartes' view is that self-knowledge of our current mental states, and important to stress the current here, because of course everyone allows that you can know things without being able to currently access what you know. You forget it, right? You say, I know that, but I just can't bring it to mind right now. But of your current judgments, your current decisions, your current intentions, your current goals, your current experiences, Descartes thinks knowledge is both complete and infallible. Complete because if you've got that mental state, you know that you've got it. And infallible because if you believe you've got that mental state, then you've got it. Okay. Aristotle held a similar view, Kant held a similar view, Locke holds a similar view. Contemporary philosophers, not so much. Most have weakened now the view, and they'd be horrified to have me call them Cartesians or semi-Cartesians, but actually it's a descendant of the view. Most people today think that we have privileged and authoritative knowledge of our own ongoing mental lives. And all likewise think that self-knowledge is different in kind from other knowledge. Right? So it's not just degrees of reliability here, it's a different kind of knowledge that you have of your own current thoughts, as opposed to what you have of the thoughts of other people by seeing what they do, hearing what they say, and so forth. And what I want to try and argue is that that's wrong, that there is no difference in kind. There's some difference in the sorts of evidence that are available in your own case and that of others, but it's the same system working in the same way. I'll briefly now talk about one contemporary view, just to illustrate. There's actually a whole range of different views that in the book I kind of go through and devote sections or chapters to. But among the philosophers who know a bunch of cognitive science, this is the one that people seem to have tried to defend. So Nichols and Stitch defend a version of it, Alvin Goldman defends a version of it. So I'll consider it briefly and show some of the problems with it. In a sense, although it's a contemporary view, it was actually introduced by Locke. The idea is that there's some sort of direct channel of information to your own current attitudes, to your own current thoughts. A bit like sensory systems gives you access to the external world, you're supposed to have this internal channel, an internal sensory system that lets you know about your own mental states. Well, so what would an inner sense system be like? Well, plainly it's going to have to be complicated. And if you know anything at all about how the brain is organized, it looks like different kinds of mental states would be primarily realized in different areas of the brain. So temporal lobe for some kinds of belief, frontal lobes for decisions, premotor cortex for your motor intentions, and so on. So if you've got a mechanism that's enabling you to know all those different kinds of mental states, it looks like it would have to be complex. It would have to be giving you connections to all those different areas of the brain. And that means it's not going to come for free. Right? So any inner sense theorist has got to have some story about why those mechanisms would have evolved. Why would they have been put into place? Why is self-knowledge a good thing to have? And about the only story that there is on the market is that it evolved for metacognitive monitoring and control of your own mental lives. So if you can monitor your ongoing mental life, you can kind of troubleshoot if you hit a problem trying to learn something or reach a decision or whatever. You can intervene, you can direct the course of your own thinking in better ways. So the hypothesis would be we evolved in a sense in order to have better metacognitive control of our own mental states. Two problems, though, when you start to look at the data, and the literature on human metacognition is extensive, right? So heavily researched in education departments and by psychologists who are interested in human learning in particular. There's a whole other literature about reasoning and one's reasoning about one's reasoning, which tends not to be treated in the same breath and doesn't figure in the same textbooks, but is actually very similar. And you look at that literature and you get very similar conclusions out of both. And that's that in both cases, the kind of cues that you use as to whether you successfully learn something, to whether you know something, whether it's worth continuing to try to bring it to mind, are roughly sensory cues. Right? So feelings of knowing, for example, tend to be driven either by the fact that you can access some fragment of what it is you're trying to remember. Right? So you're trying to remember who published Naming a Necessity. Right? And you think, geez, well, it was someone who was at Princeton. Okay, now who was it? Now you've got a little bit of the information there, and that gives you confidence that you can get some more. Moreover, all the evidence suggests that we don't have a native innately channeled competence for metacognition. So metacognitive capacities start to develop late in childhood. It seems they're dependent upon formal instruction. It's only when kids go to school that they start to learn about how to learn and learn about how to improve their reasoning and so on. And even adults tend to be pretty bad at it. Most of the studies say of meta-learning, you get very modest correlations between people's intuitions about whether they have learned something, and then they're subsequently tested and you see whether they really have learned it. Meta-comprehension of text, so if you get people to read a bit of text and ask them how well they've understood it, correlations between that and subsequent testing is often close to zero. That is important for you as students to know, right? You sometimes get the impression you're understanding a text and you're really not. But I guess it works the other way around too. So none of that suggests that there's something, what you'd expect to be the case if there is this innate, in a sense, mechanism that's evolved to make us good metacognizers, because we're not. We don't have the competence that ought to go along with it. Moreover, on the inner sense view, you ought to be able to find dissociations on all views, a dissociation in at least one direction or the other. If knowledge of other people's mental states is due to one sort of mental faculty, knowledge of your own mental states is down to inner sense, then you ought to be able to find people who are damaged in the one but not the other. And some people have made those claims, but I'm not going to go through this now, but I think the evidence just doesn't hold up. So some people have claimed that in autism what you have is damaged mind reading but intact self-knowledge. It doesn't hold water when you look at the data. People who have problems understanding other people's minds have just the same problem attributing thoughts to themselves. Some have made the converse claim for passivity forms of schizophrenia, that might be an example of damaged understanding of your own mind but intact mind reading, and again it doesn't hold up that schizophrenic people have real problems reading other minds too. And although there'd be a prediction of these views that if you try and do brain imaging experiments that you ought to find different networks implicated in self-knowledge, attributing thoughts to yourself versus attributing thoughts to others. Again, when you dig into the data, that doesn't hold up. So, what would one predict if self-knowledge isn't special? What would one predict if it's just the very same mind-reading faculty, the very same faculty that we use when understanding other people, when attributing thoughts to them, when digging behind what they're saying to figure out what it is they're trying to tell you, right, their intentions. What if it's the very same faculty that we just turn on ourselves? Right? Well, one prediction you can make is that there'd be no special metacognitive confidence. Right? So tick against that one. That seems to be what we find when we look at the data. Because the mind-reading faculty is presumably, this is the standard story in the literature, was selected for social cognitive purposes. It's because if you're going to get ahead in complex social organizations, as a highly social creature, as our ancestors always were, you need to be able to figure out what others in the group are likely to do, what they think about you, what they would react with if you did such and such to them, and so forth. And lo and behold, there is some evidence that, I think convincing evidence that there's some degree of mind reading in other primates as well, just as you would predict from this. You'd also predict on this view that there'd be no dissociations between self-knowledge and other knowledge. If you've got the same faculty, the mind-reading faculty, that can either be turned outwards or inwards, well, then you would expect it would stand or fall together. Right? You'd be bad at both or you'd be good at both. Tick against that one, because that's the way the data goes. But you'd also predict this, and this is the one I'm going to spend some time defending for you. You'd also predict that people would make systematic mistakes about their own current thoughts. If you can provide them with either behavioral cues or other kinds of sensory cues of the sort that might mislead a third person, right? If you were reading someone else's mind, if you were trying to decide what they were thinking, and you had similar cues, you'd say they're thinking of P, right, when in fact they're not. Well, if you can give people similar cues about themselves, you predict they'd make mistakes about themselves. And I think that's what we find, and that's what I'm going to illustrate. I'll give you 4 data points. There are more. And as I say, this data I think is problematic for all the competing views, not just for the inner sense view, but others that I haven't talked about. Okay, so here's the first set of data. This is for a really neat paper by Johansson and colleagues that appeared in Science a few years back. I'm happy to, if you want the references, you can ping me an email afterwards and I'll give you the details. What they had was subjects looking at pairs of photographs and picking the person that they found most attractive. So they just had to point for one that they thought was the most attractive of the 2 individuals on offer. And then the photos were laid face down. The selected photo, the one they'd pointed at, was represented to them, and they were asked to say why it was they picked that one. Okay. And that happened all within 2 seconds. So on any view that thinks there's some kind of introspective faculty there, the reasons for picking should still have been accessible. Because I think on any view there'd be some kind of short-term memory system that would hold information. And he said, think of the self-monitoring story, right? If you're going to have self-monitoring for control, you've got to be able to hold on to what's happened recently if you're going to have any sense of what you were trying to do so that you can now correct it. But on some trials, the experimenters used sleight of hand to present the subject with the photo which was actually the one they rejected, not the one they'd selected. And the first finding, which is really quite surprising, is that very few people noticed. And actually, I think no one said, but that's not the one I chose. I mean, some said, why on earth did I choose that one? Okay, which gave you some inkling that something had gone wrong. They'd spotted something was wrong. And so you can think of this as an example of change blindness that psychologists have investigated. Okay, so here's the setup. You're first off shown these 2 photos. The subject points at one to make a selection. They're laid face down. The person slips this one forward, turn it over, and notice that in this case, this is one of the experimental trials, the probe trials. This is the one that was rejected. This is the one that they hadn't pointed at. And here's an example of the kinds of photos they were looking at. So this is an example. They had 2 conditions. They had similar faces and they had dissimilar faces. So this is an example from the dissimilar set. I mean, as you can see, this woman has her hair down over her ears. Here, her hair is pulled back. She's got these big earrings. The jaw is really quite a different shape and so on. So not difficult to distinguish these 2 women from one another. And here's the data for detection. So what I didn't say is they had a number of further conditions. In one case, they were allowed to look at the represented photo for only 2 seconds, and then they had to say why they picked it. In another case, they had it for 5 seconds. In another condition, it was just free. They could hold it in their hand for as long as they liked, while they talked about why they had picked that one. Okay. Similar, dissimilar, similar, dissimilar. Okay. The black bars are bars for concurrent detection. Now that, as I said, was never someone saying, oh, but that's not the one I picked. It was people saying things like, oh, why did I pick that one? I don't really understand, or something like that. They had a measure of retrospective detection, where at the end of a series, they'd asked subjects, did you feel there's anything funny about any of those trials that we gave you? And if people said any sort of yes, I mean, they were very generous in their scoring, any kind of indication that they thought something funny was going on, they got into this group. I forget what possible retrospective detection was. It was something even weaker again. But notice that even if you go with the retrospective detection one, here you've got only 10% of subjects, 10% of trials with any sort of detection. Even when they're holding it in their hands for as long as you like, it only goes up to 20%. So in a lot of these trials, complete unawareness of anything happening. But for our purposes, what matters more is the sorts of things they said when asked, when trying to say why they had picked the picture in question. And there are absolutely no differences. Right? Whether they were looking at the picture that they had actually selected, and that was the majority of the trials, okay, and saying why they had selected that one, or whether they were looking at the picture that they had actually rejected, and were now saying why they had picked it. Right? You've got exactly the same specificity in the reasons that were being given, right? So in the example we had, someone might say, oh, I really like those earrings, they really set off her face, although the one they'd chosen didn't have earrings, or at least not that you could see. The same certainty in terms of the answers they were giving. There was no more or less confidence in the answers they were giving for why they'd chosen things. The same sort of degree of emotional engagement that they'd had. And when they threw a whole battery of statistical measures at the corpus of reports, there were no significant differences between the two. So we've got a readiness to confabulate here. Plainly, what people were offering in the way of reasons were not the reasons they had for making the original choice, because they couldn't have had as a reason that they liked the earrings, because there were no earrings. Okay. What they're doing is, after the fact, just looking at what is in front of them and saying what now seems plausible about why they would have picked that one. And, I mean, among other things, and there's actually lots and lots of data to this effect, it shows that we've got really very little access to the factors that determine whether we like something or not. I mean, when you're presented with something, you can know whether or not you like it, but why you like it, which properties are causing the liking, no, it's really no access. Okay, here's another set of data. Completely different paradigm. Nodding while listening to a message increases your belief in that message. Shaking your head decreases it. So these were rather neat experiments where people were told they were going to be testing the headphones they were wearing to see how they stay on your head. Right? So one group were told, well, we want you to do this, and they made them practice a bit to get the timing of it right. And the other group were told, we want you to be doing this. Okay. And they were told, well, you know, by the way, we also want to see that the auditory system works properly while you're shaking your head. So there'll be something going on in there, but don't bother about it, it's not part of the experiment. And then afterwards they're asked, you know, and incidentally, did you agree with what was being said? And what you find is, if you've been nodding along, you get higher reports of belief, and if you've been shaking your head, you get lower reports of belief. So, one interpretation would be subjects are interpreting their own behavior, just as if you were watching someone else nodding along while they're listening to a message, you think, hey, they're agreeing with it. Right? And if you had to signify the degree of belief that they have in it, you'd ratchet it up a bit.
Did they run this with Greeks? Because the Greeks have the reverse.
No, this was done with Americans.
Okay.
So there need be no claim here that nodding and head shaking is innate.
Right.
It can be a learned signal of agreement. Yeah. An alternative interpretation, though, might be that maybe what's happening is that when you're nodding your head, that kind of primes for positive reactions to the message you're listening to, and that would actually increase your degree of belief. Okay? And then maybe you're just introspecting that result. So this would be an interpretation that would be consistent with the existence of introspection, if you believe. But in a rather nice manipulation, one of the people who was involved in the original studies was able to rule this out by varying the convincingness of the message. The two basic conditions now were that they either had someone saying really rather plausible things, offering good arguments for a conclusion, and in another condition they had them offering awful arguments, really weak ones. When they were offering good arguments, the original effect was replicated. Right? If you were nodding your head, you tended to have a higher degree of belief. If you were shaking your head, a lower degree. But when the arguments were really weak, you got a crossover. People then went the other way. If they were nodding their head while listening, you got an even lower degree of belief in the message. If you were shaking your head, you got even higher. And they asked for people's reports on what was going through their minds while they were thinking, while they were listening to the message. And their interpretation is that they were reading their own head nodding as agreeing with their own reactions. Right? So if you were listening to a really weak argument and you say to yourself in inner speech, oh, what an idiot, okay? You interpret your head nodding as confirming your reaction, namely, he's an idiot, namely, my degree of belief should go down. Right? Whereas if you're shaking your head, there's then an inconsistency. And so there's no change, or your degree of belief, if anything, goes up. You're disagreeing with, but, oh, what an idiot. They also had a completely different manipulation, where they asked people to write 3 statements about themselves that they thought might impact their future careers. And one group wrote, they were all right-handed people, one group wrote in their right hands, and another group wrote with their left hands. And then they did some other stuff, and then they were asked to give their degree of confidence in the statements that they'd written. Right? So how confident are you in the truth of that? And you get much lower reports of confidence in the people who have written left-handed. Because it looks shaky. It looks as if someone isn't writing with full confidence, right? And indeed, when you get third parties, other people, to look at those statements, the right-handed ones, the left-handed ones, they too, if you ask them, how confident do you think the writer was when he wrote that, you get exactly the same scoring. Right? So it's the same mind-reading function that's going on either way. You're reading your own degree of confidence from your behavior, or you do the same for someone else. Okay, third set of data. This is Wegner Weekly, which is neat. This is about your knowledge of your own intentions. So subjects thought they were doing this with another subject. They were told that this was going to be an experiment to see how feelings of control come and go. They're both using this kind of Ouija board mouse to control the cursor on the screen, and you can't see the details here, but there's pictures of lots of different familiar objects there, right? So there's an open umbrella, there's a child pushchair, there's a doll, there's a teddy bear, and so on. And they were told, you're going to move it around on this screen for about 30 seconds. At some point during that, you'll hear a word spoken. That's just a distractor, don't worry about it. Then some music will start playing, and when the music starts playing, wait a few moments, and then bring the cursor to a stop, wherever you choose to. Okay? And the subject thinks what was actually a confederated experimenter is doing the same thing, getting the same instructions. In fact, the confederate is getting instructions through her headphones from the experimenters as to what to do with the Ouija board. And then immediately afterwards, subjects, as soon as they'd finished, again, there's no more than a second or two interval between the completion of the episode and the report. As soon as it was finished, they had to pull the scale off their laps and report on a 100-degree scale what they believed about that trial, right? So either 0, I allowed the stop to happen, the other person was in control, or 100, I intended to make this stop. My intention brought it to a stop. So a number of different conditions in here. Under one condition, the confederate was told, keep your hands on there, but don't do anything. Right? So just let her, the experimental subject, have complete control, stop it where she wants to stop it. Okay? So there's actually no contribution from the other subject, and here's the scoring you get in that condition. Just a little bit above midpoint. Now, that's exactly what you predict if people don't have access to their intentions, because people would start with the default assumption that there's going to be dual control, right? Because there's 2 people and you think you're both contributing, so your default should be, well, I'm going to be 50% in control of this. And then you might expect just a little bit of, ratcheting upwards when you actually have complete control, because you might not get the kind of resistance on the cursor that you might have predicted, right? Everything's going smoothly as you move your fingers around, so there's no points at which you meet resistance. And that seems to be the effect. if there is introspection for intentions, this is really puzzling. Because I mean, since it was her intention, her decision that brought it to a stop at a particular point, you'd expect people to have a really powerful sense of causality there. Right? Just like when you flick on a switch and there's a thunderclap, you momentarily at least think, geez, did I cause that? Right? Anything that's temporally paired really close, people at least initially have the impression of causality, and here they ought to have had the strong feeling that they'd caused it to stop, because they said stop now, and it stopped right then. Under Confederate control, where it's the confederate of the experimenter who's being told through the head friends, okay, now move it up a little, now move it to the left, now move it up this way. Right? You get scoring just a little bit below midpoint, and that too makes sense, right? There'd be, presumably people are sensitive to the resistance that they're meeting now, that they're thinking go this way, and it doesn't go that way. But now the interesting one, in the conditions where the confederate was guided to make the stop next to the pictured object that the person heard the name of while the experiment was going on. Remember I said they would hear a word. And if they heard the word umbrella within 5 or so seconds of the end of the trial, then they had a much bigger impression that they had caused that stop. Just what you predict if you think, well, there's kind of interpretation going on and sensory cues are helping you. You expect the mind-reading system to think, hey, I just was thinking about an umbrella and now it stopped next to the umbrella, so probably I caused that. Right? That was my intention. And here it goes way up above the case where they actually have full control. This is a no control case, just like this one, and there's a big difference between these two. Okay, so these results are ones that you predict if self-knowledge isn't special, if it's just using the same mind-reading system on yourself. I think they're anomalous to a traditional account. Okay, final set of confabulation data comes from the counter-attitudinal advocacy paradigm in social psychology. So there have been hundreds and hundreds of experiments done on this paradigm, right? And the results are really quite strong. The general setup is generally done with undergrad students. You'd come into the experiment and you'd be told, well, what the committee that's deciding whether or not to raise student tuition next term needs to have some arguments on both sides. Right? And what we've been asked to do is to collect those arguments from students. And of course we need arguments on both sides. Right? And some of the subjects would then be asked, and we'd like you to write an essay arguing why tuition should be raised next term. Now this is something that we know the students don't actually believe, either because you can just take a survey of other students, and indeed they don't believe that, or you can actually have asked those very same students in an unrelated way, say a month earlier, as part of some other class, as part of a questionnaire they were filling in, right? What do you think about higher tuition next term? Is that a good idea or not? So you've got people arguing against what they actually believe. Okay? Under two separate conditions. There's the high choice and low choice conditions. Actually, they're both choice, but it's just made less salient. In the high choice condition, the experimenters might say, we'd like this essay written, please, but of course, you're free to decline. No pressure here. If the person does decline, they say, well, we really do need some negative essays to be written. I mean, we'd like you to do it, but of course, you're entirely free to decline. No one ever declines. Whereas in the low choice, they'd come in and the experimenters would say, so we need these essays written. You've been assigned to the right in favor of higher tuition rates. Here's your bit of paper, please start. Okay. So not at all emphasized that there's a choice. Well, what's known is that the high choice condition issues in what got to be called dissonance. You can think of it as a kind of guilt or regret or cognitive discomfort. And we know that it does issue in a negative emotional state because you can give people mood questionnaires after they've written the essay, and lo and behold, people in the high choice counter-attitudinal advocacy condition and only in that condition are feeling bad. Okay? If you do it in the low choice counter-attitudinal advocacy, no change. If you're writing in favor of what you believe in, no change. And what the finding is that people, if in a seemingly unrelated questionnaire a little bit later in the experiment, they're asked to say what they think about higher tuition next term, people in that condition, and only that condition, the high choice counter-attitudinal advocacy condition, shift their own attitudes. And seemingly to get rid of the dissonance, and we actually know that's successful because if you questionnaire them about their mood just after they've given the answer, it's returned to normal. Right? No problems, they're not feeling bad anymore. Now it's got nothing to do with the quality of the arguments they offer. You can take the sets of arguments from the four conditions, right? The counter-attitudinal advocacy, the pro-attitudinal advocacy, and the high choice, low choice, give them to independent raters. There's no significant differences. So it's not that these folks, and only these folks, are managing to convince themselves, really, that tuition should be raised, or at least it's really mysterious how that would happen. It seems to be rather a kind of emotional self-regulation. Now these results can really be quite strong. You can get changes from strong opposition to higher tuition to being mildly in favour. Right? So it's not just that the results are statistically significant, you get people crossing the midline, right? So that they're now saying the opposite, at least to some degree, of what they believed before. But without awareness of what they're doing. And if you think about it for a moment, it has to be without awareness, because if it was awareness, if they were simultaneously aware, I think tuition should not be raised, but I'm now saying it should be, they ought to be aware that they're lying. Right? And that ought to make them feel worse, not better. It's not going to make their feelings of guilt or discomfort or cognitive conflict go away. All that would stay in place. Okay, so the traditional interpretation was that dissonance is about a feeling of inconsistency. It's the inconsistency between what one's doing, what one's arguing, and what one actually believes that gives rise to the unpleasant feelings. Turns out that's not true, and what's really driving it is the feeling that one's done something bad. And what shows this was a really neat set of experiments using the boomerang condition. So one group of students in this condition were told that there was a new psychological discovery. And that's that essays read early in the sequence have the opposite effect to that intended. Right? So if you think of the committee that's going to be reviewing these essays and looking at the arguments and trying to decide whether to raise tuition, the finding is essays read early in the sequence, if they argue for a tuition raise, will actually make the reader inclined not to raise tuition. And if they argue against a tuition raise, they'll actually be inclined to make the reader raise tuition. Right? So hence the boomerang effect. Arguments will have the opposite effect to that intended. Of course, this is completely fictional, but students, being good students and believing professors, believed that this was real. Okay. Sorry, back up. What you find in this condition is that the high choice pro-attitude advocacy changes belief. So people who've argued in favor of what they actually believed, tuition should not be raised, when they later learn that their essay is going to go early in the sequence, right? The experimenter seems to pull a number out of a hat and says, oh, your essay is going to go number 2, by the way. Okay. When they later learn that, when they're asked later what they believe, they say, oh, raising tuition would not be bad. They wrote an essay saying it would be bad, right? What they actually believe, that it would be bad, but now they say, oh, it wouldn't be bad. Okay? Because they feel they've done something bad. they feel, because of this boomerang effect, that having written in favour of tuition should not be raised, damn it, now maybe I'm going to make it the case that tuition will be raised, because of the boomerang effect. And saying the opposite of what they believe is now to make themselves feel better about it. In other experiments, it's not just that people will change what they say about what they believe, they'll also deny responsibility, or they'll deny the importance of the issue, even though when questionnared earlier they'd say it's a really important issue, they'll say it isn't. And this is what knocks out of the water the idea that all of these changes would really have taken place already and are just being introspected. People use only the first option open to them. Right? So if as a result of doing all this, they get asked 3 questions in different conditions in different orders, either to what extent were you responsible for the writing of that essay, how important is the question of whether tuition should be raised or not, and do you think tuition should be raised or not? Whichever of those is offered first, they shift their attitude. The others remain unchanged. So it's not that before they get asked those questions, all of those things had shifted, and they're just introspecting their belief, because then it would be mysterious why they would have flipped back again on the numbers 2 and 3. What's really going on, I think, is in the style of Damasio, what people are doing is rehearsing the behavioral options open to them. Right? So if you imagine they're now faced with the question, there's a scale on there, you can imagine your finger hovering over the 2 or the 3, or right, which is going to express your degree of belief that tuition should or should not be raised. Okay. So they're rehearsing an action, and the one that's appraised as representing their action as not bad feels right. Their emotional systems are responding with, yeah, that feels right, that feels like the one to go for. And the reason they're getting that feeling is because their emotional systems are, as it were, seeing that if they gave that answer, then what they did was not a bad thing after all. Right? Because raising tuition would not be bad. Right? But at the same time, of course, they're being asked a direct question about their belief. So it would be mysterious if their underlying belief wasn't active at the same time. Okay. But to repeat the point, they can't be aware of it. Because if they were, they'd be aware they were lying, and the whole getting rid of the unpleasant feelings would not work. So this is a fairly direct argument, I think, that there's no direct introspection to your active judgments, right, to things that you actively believe. Okay, so all of this data that I've been going through, I think, raises problems for all the traditional theories, not just inner sense theories. Subjects should, in these conditions, just be able to introspect their current judgments or decisions or intentions. So what are the options? Well, if you want to hang on to any version of the traditional theory, you've got to switch to what are sometimes now called dual method theory. And indeed, that's exactly what Nichols and Stitch do, it's exactly what Goldman does. You say, well, sometimes there's introspection, but sometimes we self-interpret. Right? So sometimes we're using self-directed mind reading, sometimes we have direct access to our own thoughts. And these clever social psychologists just happen to have hit on the cases where we do self-interpretation. What you need, though, if you're going to be a dual method theorist, is you need some account of the conditions under which each method is going to be used. Otherwise, although simply saying there's 2 methods employed is kind of consistent with the data, it's incapable of explaining it. You need to have some concrete proposal about when the 2 conditions are going to be used so that you can predict the data, you can save the data. But there is no such account. I mean, there are various options on the market. One, this is Nichols and Stitch, is that introspection will be used when all you need to do is report a thought. Mind reading will be used when you need to do self-explanation, right? When you need to provide an explanation of something that you've done. But that's plainly not going to work. You just have to think of the experiments I've just reported, the dissonance experiments. All the people are asked there is, what do you think about higher tuition? No explanations. They're not being asked to explain why they're doing the thing, they're just being asked, what do you think? Okay. So, this ought to be a self-attribution case, you ought to be able to introspect on this view. Okay, so I think dual method theories just can't explain the patterning in the data. There's a sense in which in the abstract they're consistent with the data, but they can't explain it. They can't tell you why you get confabulation in this case, but accurate self-report in that one. Okay, so that's the end of the evidence against the opposition, and correlatively some of the evidence in favor of this theory, the interpretive sensory access theory. I'll spend just a few slides now elaborating on the positive view. So the basic claim is that self-knowledge results from turning the mind-reading resources, the very same faculty that you use when reading other people's minds, on yourself. It's just self-directed mind-reading. And using the same channels of information, right? The same sensory channels that we use when reading other people's minds. So if I want to know what you're thinking, of course I have to rely on vision of your facial expression, or your gestures, or your body posture, or I rely on auditory experience of what you're saying to me, and smell, not so much, but touch, yes, when the way in which someone strokes your arm can tell you something about what they're thinking at the time, and so on. And the claim is very same modes of access used for self-knowledge. And the picture is that the mind-reading faculty is there as one of the consumer systems of so-called globally broadcast mental events. So I'll illustrate this in the diagram in just a second. But folks in the consciousness literature say the really distinctive thing that distinguishes between conscious experiences and unconscious ones is that the conscious ones, when attended to, get made widely accessible across many brain systems. And you can actually see wide areas of the brain light up under the two conditions when carefully controlled. So you broadcast to lots of different systems. Well, of course, mind reading would need to have access to those broadcasts. I mean, you couldn't begin to attribute thoughts to other people without having access to conscious perception of what they're doing, conscious auditory experience of what they're saying, and so forth. So on this view, as a result, we do have introspective access to our own experiences, to our own sensory events, because those are going to be there available as immediate input to the mind-reading system. Right? So there's no interpretation needed for what you're seeing, what you're imagining, right? What somasensory events are the same, right? What you're feeling in a bodily way, your feelings of desire for something. All of those are going to be available as input. But for attitude events, events that are not sensory events, have got to rely on interpretation. Right? So your access to your own judgments, your decisions, your intentions, which are normally thought of as non-sensory events, there you'll have to rely on interpretation, just like you do for other people, using as data your overt behavior, right? So remembering the head nodding cases, right? The context that you're in, visual imagery perhaps, your own inner speech. So some of these items of data wouldn't be available for other people. I'll return to that in a minute, right? You never have awareness of my inner speech, just my outer speech, but your own emotional feelings and so on. But these are all data for interpretation, not direct access. So here's the picture of the kind of way in which I envisage it, right? So you've got a whole bunch of sensory systems all collapsed together into one box here. Of course, they're at least partially separate from one another. Top-down attention, I haven't got bottom-up attention represented, but both exist. Top-down attention, partly determining which representations coming out of here get to make it into their global workspace, get to be accessible then to a whole bunch of conceptual and affective systems, systems that are evaluating what you're seeing or hearing, systems that are trying to make sense of it in conceptual terms. Right? Is that a dog or a fox? a bunch of executive systems that will be charged with deciding what to do. Shall I go this way, that way, pick this one or that one? Okay. And I imagine the mind reading system being one of these systems here, taking input from a global workspace or from working memory, which uses the same resources as global broadcasting. So anything that makes it into here can be attributed directly to the self. Things like your intentions will only have an indirect effect on what gets in here by perhaps helping to generate an item of inner speech, which will then be broadcast within the same network, or manipulating a visual image or whatever. Okay, well, if this view is right, you might say, well, how come then self-interpretation is so reliable? Well, one might challenge whether it really is reliable. In fact, what's the evidence? But, rather than take that direct challenge on, I'd say, well, there's at least two things you could appeal to explain why knowing your own thoughts might be more reliable than knowing others. One thing is just that you've got more data. Right? When I want to know what you're thinking, I have to wait till you say it aloud. If I want to know what I'm thinking, I listen to my own inner speech. Of course, I can't hear your inner speech. If I want to know what you're thinking, I don't have direct access to your emotional feelings. I do have direct access to my own. So there's kinds of data, items of data that are available in one's own case, but not others. But these are all sensory data, remember, not themselves attitudes like judgments or decisions or intentions. And moreover, once you do make a self-attribution, those can become self-fulfilling, especially if you make the attribution overtly in public. Right? Once you've said, I've decided to do this, well, then you interpret yourself as having made that decision, even if initially it was confabulated, and then you'll feel sort of obliged to do it. Right? That'll create now a motivation to actually do what you said you intend to do, even if the initial self-attribution was false. And so your behavior will be consistent with that self-attribution. So it will make it seem that you had self-knowledge when actually you didn't. Right? So think of the confabulation experiments and the counter-attitudinal advocacy again. The effects of dissonance experiments last at least for 2 or 3 weeks. When people have done follow-up experiments, they find some effect of the manipulation. As if people are remembering, well, I said it wouldn't be bad if tuition should be raised, and they now feel obliged to say the same. Right? It starts to tail off, but the effects are still there. Another challenge. Well, but look, you can ask me what I think about something, and I can answer immediately. Even though I'm sitting quietly, I'm not doing anything, I'm not nodding my head, there's nothing going on, and I might not have anything in my inner speech going on in advance of me saying what I think. Right? So you ask me, what's the capital of France? And I say, well, Paris. Now, how did I come up with that report of my belief if there's no introspection of belief? Well, answer. In order to generate speech, you don't have to have introspective access to your own beliefs. So some system has to have access to it. There has to be information from beliefs making it to the language faculty and being one of the influences on what the language faculty constructs. And of course, whether you reply Paris or I believe it's Paris is often just largely done for effect rather than making a big semantic difference. Okay? And one of the points here is, no one thinks that speech in general requires metacognitive access to beliefs. Right? So people have models of speech generation which sometimes begin, in many models they do, with the thought to be communicated, right? Which is just a first order representation. Paris is the capital of France. That's the thought to be communicated. And then they try and tell some story about how you pull together syntax and semantics and pragmatics and so on to generate an utterance. But no one thinks that speech begins with, I believe that Paris is the capital of France, to to generate the answer. Right? So no one thinks it should start with a metacognitive or an introspective awareness of belief. Okay, one more slide on just to point out some coherences with well-accepted cognitive scientific theories that this account has. I mean, it fits really rather nicely with the global broadcasting architecture that sort of depends on it. That people like Bernie Bars and Stan Kane and many others have come to accept, Dan Dennett too. I think there's lots of evidence now being accumulated that something like that is right, that there is a broadcast of attended sensory information in the brain to a wide range of systems. And I think it's just sort of blindingly obvious that mind reading would have to be one of the systems that can access that as input. It couldn't do its job unless it had access to sensory representations of what's there in the world. And we know that imagistic representations use the very same resources and generate the very same sorts of outputs as do perception. So your own inner speech should be accessible to you in just the way that outer speech is. And it fits nicely too with dominant accounts of working memory. So this is Alan Badley and many other recent people. So on this view, notice there's another controversial claim, which I could defend in a separate talk, that all what you might think of as central process conscious thinking depends on imagistic representations or representations that have a kind of sensory basis. Things like inner speech, visual imagery, and so forth. There's no conscious, amodal propositional thought. Okay, so what then about the intuition that everyone has that there's something special about self-knowledge? That when you attribute a thought to yourself, you're not interpreting yourself, you're just reporting what's manifest to yourself, right? What you somehow have direct access to. Everyone has that intuition. I have that intuition. You might think, especially if you're the kind of philosopher who thinks we should try and save the intuitions, this would at least be a consideration on the other side. Right? But on my view, we're required to reject that intuition as illusory. And that's what I do by trying to explain it away, by explaining how we would come to have that intuition, even if it's completely false, as indeed that it is. Well, remember how the intuition kind of breaks down. There's a component of completeness. Sometimes it's expressed in terms of mental states being self-presenting. So it's the intuition that if one is in a mental state, then one knows one's in that mental state. And things that conflict with this kind of sound anomalous, right? So if I say to you, Mary has just decided right now to go to the party tonight, but she doesn't know that she has. It sounds sort of weird, right? You hang on. And you then have to search for an interpretation where somehow she reached the decision unconsciously or something, right? And you might come up with one. But initially, if you're doing linguistics, you'd want to put a star against the sentence. It kind of sounds anomalous. The other half of this is the infallibility claim. And there ought to be a modal thing on the front here, necessarily or something, right? And if one believes that one's in a mental state, then one is. And here too, if you conflict with this, it sounds anomalous, right? So Mary thinks she's just decided to go to the party, but she hasn't really. That too sounds sort of weird, right? Well, remembering these are the strong claims that Descartes would have defended, that now we can, but still, versions of them are still in play, and still, you don't have to claim infallibility, you just claim, well, really strong authoritative access, right? That if you believe you've got a mental state, somehow you're authoritative about it, no one can overturn that. And to take account of everyone accepts that there's unconscious beliefs, one would accept that it's going to be a subset, right? Well, it would only be like conscious ones that you'd have this kind of access So here's the competing story. The intuitions that we have of what I call transparency would come from two sources. One is the fact that mind reading is largely unconscious. You just have to reflect on what happens in your interactions with other people to see that that's true. Right? So as I've been speaking, I hope you haven't been continually struggling to think, oh, why did he say that? Right? You've been hearing me as expressing thoughts and judgments as I go along. And that's even more obvious when the subject matter isn't difficult, but kind of everyday. And if you see someone fumbling with the handle of a door, you'll just see them as trying to get it open. It's an immediate sort of quasi-perceptual judgment. Sometimes, of course, we become conscious that we're trying to interpret someone. Sometimes we think, geez, why is he doing that? And you start to ask yourself questions and so on. You play like Sherlock Holmes. You think, well, if it was this, you do that. But most of the time, mind reading is just swift and intuitive, and you just see what someone's up to. And then likewise in one's own case. Most of the time, when one's reaching these self-interpretations, of course, you're not aware that you've entered into an interpretive process. You just get the result. I'm thinking of people. Moreover, I think that one can make a good case for there being a pair of innate, or actually, even if you take, I myself am inclined to believe that the basis of mind reading is innately channeled, but even if you go for a learning account, you can actually make the same kind of argument. But just ignore this for a moment. Innate processing rules, I collapse them both into one here. If one thinks one's in a mental state M, then you immediately conclude in the mental state M. So this is, in effect, an implicit generalization that exactly matches the explicit ones that I had on the previous slide. Right? Where on the previous slide, this was put into a statement. If you're in a mental state, so if you think you're in a mental state, then you are in that mental state. Here, it's done, you're entitled to move from John thinks he's in a mental state P, conclude John's in mental state P. Okay? So it's a processing rule. It's a rule that the mind reading system would employ. Now, why would it have a rule like that? Well, I think if you think in terms of reverse engineering, if I were building a mind reading system, I'd want to put exactly those rules in there. Why? Well, think what the mind reading system has to do a lot of the time. People spend a lot of time talking with one another about their mental states. They talk about what they feel, what they want, what they think about this, what they think about that. The mind reading system has to contribute to trying to interpret those utterances. In particular, it has to try and determine whether the speaker is being sincere. So if someone says, well, I really want to help you with that. Well, the semantics of that you extract as saying that they want to help. But now you've got to decide, well, are they really being sincere? Are they being honest in saying that? Or are they just trying to get on my good side or whatever? That's a difficult mind-reading task. Suppose that having done that, you then faced another task. You had to try and decide whether this is one of those cases where the person might be confabulating. So although speaking sincerely, right, with no intent to deceive you, nevertheless they don't really have any such desire because they're misinterpreting themselves. Right? They're misattributing a thought to themselves. But how do you begin to settle that? At the very least, you'd have to start looking for other evidence and data and so forth. It would slow you down. You'd expect that the whole process would become much more computationally demanding and slower, and probably more unreliable. I mean, it's familiar in cognitive science that often the quick and dirty heuristic processes can be more reliable than longer and more computationally demanding ones, just because there's more sources of error in those. So if I were building a mind-reading system, I'd build in just those rules. You simplify it, you make it swifter, and probably you couldn't make it any better by making people aware that people often self-interpret. I mean, another way of putting these rules is that you can think of them as embodying a kind of model of the mind as self-transparent to itself into the mind-reading faculty itself. And so when you're interpreting other people, you assume they have access to their own mental states. And of course, when you turn that on yourself, that gives you the same assumption about yourself. Okay, so if this were right, I mean, I think it explains why these self-transparency intuitions are so pervasive. It's there in much of Western thought from Aristotle onwards. It continues to be there in contemporary philosophical thought, only weakened down to try and take account of some of the results from cognitive science. It's there in Eastern thought, very explicitly in the traditions of the Indian subcontinent. So far as one can tell, it's there in ancient Chinese thought before the influence of Buddhism, where you might have thought it contaminated it. Strikingly, no tradition anywhere that I know of ever evinces a skeptical tradition about one's own mind. Of course, skeptics are very common from the Greeks onwards, right? Lots of people think that we can be skeptical about all sorts of things, the past, the external world, and so on. No one says, but you can't know your own thoughts. No one, as far as I know. Okay. Well, why not? Well, because if you have these processing rules built into their mind-reading system, that would strike them as just an obviously false and crazy thing to try and doubt. You just have to raise the possibility to have the intuition, immediate intuition that it's false. By the way, it also explains the vigorous resistance that many people have had to the idea of unconscious mental events. Larry Weisskranz, who is one of the people who did the work on blindsight, described to me the struggle that he had over 3 decades to get the scientific community to take it seriously. Everyone had the intuition that it couldn't be right, that there couldn't be unconscious visual perception. Why would they have such a strong intuition? Well, if you have a model like this, that if you are perceiving at P, you know that you're perceiving at P, and so on. Explain it. Well, I think traditional theories would have to try and explain the intuition in terms of truth. I mean, it would be a bit like, you know, why do people universally believe that water is wet? Well, because it is, and it's kind of, they soon discover that it is. So why do people believe that minds are transparent to themselves? Well, because they are, and there's a bit of a problem how they discover that they are. But I think in any case, it's not going to explain the modal status of intuition, right? The sense that in some sense it's necessary that if you've got a mental state, you know that you've got it. Okay, so summary slide. The conclusion I'm urging on you is that we ought to accept the ISA theory, the theory that self-knowledge is all a matter of interpretation of one's sensory experiences using sensory cues to attribute thoughts and judgments to oneself. I think that it's simpler than the competing theories, because given the data, all the competing theories need at least to be dual method theories. Right? So you have to say there's introspection and there's self-interpretation. So everyone has to accept that this happened, right? And everyone does who knows the data. Okay? So at least we've got simplicity on one side if one says, and that covers all the data. Right? There's just one thing that we need, mind reading self-directed, not 2. There's many fewer anomalies on this view. I mean, each of the competing theories runs up against problems with some of the data. There are some problems with this view that I haven't talked about, but many fewer of them. And I think it fits in better with the surrounding sort of cognitive scientific theories about verbal broadcasting and working memory and so forth. And it's the only theory whose predictions are actually confirmed by the data. Right? So remember, it predicts that there should be confabulation, and lo and behold there is. It predicts that there shouldn't be dissociations, and we can't find any. It predicts that there should be no native competence for metacognitive control, and looks like there isn't, and so on. Okay, so that's me. I'll just leave you with a pretty picture.
5-minute break so you can stretch your legs and gather back here for questions if